Radio show.
Father Thomas, when did you first realize that becoming a priest was something that you were going to do?
Well, when I was a child, I think from the time I was in maybe grade school, around third or fourth grade, I had, I think I had aspirations to become a priest, and I think that certainly that was on my mind until I probably finished eighth grade, and then went off to high school. And while I was in high school, the thoughts and desires for priesthood really kind of faded away. And it wasn't until I was about 20 years of age that we had a change in the pastor of our parish and a young deacon who came to serve an internship. And I then kind of began rethinking about the possibility of the priesthood. So from an early age, the parish I grew up in and my family, and I grew up in a very, very strong Catholic milieu, and I think we were certainly very close to the priests and the sisters, so I'm sure that had a lot to do with it, but I always felt drawn to what they did.
Well, how do you become an exorcist in the Catholic Church?
Well, that's a very good question. It's usually not something you apply for. Usually the bishop of the local diocese will ask a particular priest or maybe even several priests, and usually they're guys who've been ordained for some kind of significant period of time. I would say minimum of 5 years or more. But it's not something you normally go and volunteer for. It's usually something that the bishop seeks you out. Usually it's because he recognizes that maybe your own educational background and spiritual background might be such that you might be suitable and more inclined to consider that kind of role. But it's usually where the bishop does the asking.
Okay, so what exactly is an exorcism, and when did the practice of exorcism very first start?
Well, the practice of exorcism, that's kind of that's a question that has could have several answers. The practice of formal, solemn exorcisms in the Roman Catholic tradition began in the year 1614 when the ritual was first published. However, historically speaking, exorcisms have been going on even prior to the establishment of Christianity. Jesus performed exorcisms. There was no ritual per se for all the centuries preceding 1614, but exorcisms did take place. In the Old Testament, there were clear indications that exorcisms of some sort took place in the book of Deuteronomy, because the Jews were certainly very prone to paganism, and that's been demonstrated throughout the history of the Old Testament, where very, very often during the prophetic age, the prophets were raised up, certainly in times of spiritual crisis, and oftentimes it was because of the practice of idolatry and paganism. So there's really several answers to your question. The formal rite, recognized rite, began in 1614. For all the centuries prior, certainly exorcisms were performed, but certainly did not have an authenticated rite or ritual, but certainly they were performed. They certainly were performed by Jesus, and they certainly were performed in the Old Testament.
So when do you actually get involved? When do you know if someone is actually possessed and it's not some sort of mental, a disability or something like that?
Well, there's a whole discernment that the exorcist, in consultation with a whole group of professionals, goes through. So when someone comes in and meets with me the first time, after some initial prayer, then I ask a whole battery of questions about the person's background in terms of their upbringing, their practice of the faith, if they are Catholic, or even if they're not Catholic, or if they are they Christian? Are they baptized Christian? If so, have they practiced? Questions about prior mental health issues, questions about any history of sexual abuse, any history of physical abuse, any history of addictions to drugs, alcohol, food, pornography, any history of violence, any experiences that would have been considered traumatic. Those certainly have any history of involvement with the occult or the New Age or the satanic.
So all those situations that you're saying right now are situations that could render someone vulnerable to possession.
Yes, they could. Those are all doorways. And so all of those are asked in the first session. And then I usually pray deliverance prayer over the person at some point. And very often, depending on what the person tells me, I usually will have them evaluated by our clinical psychologist. I have a team. So on my team, I have a medical doctor, clinical psychologist, psychiatrist, all of whom are practicing Catholics, all of whom believe in the possibility of satanic existence. I also have a prayer team and a discerner, and the prayer team and the discerner and usually several priests will be present for every exorcism and some of the deliverances.
Father Thomas, how would you say exorcisms, if they have, how have they changed from antiquity to modern times?
Well, I think one thing that certainly changed is the acknowledgement and use of medical and social sciences. And again, this is a guess. I mean, I can't give you a blow-by-blow history of what was it like in antiquity. I mean, we know when Jesus performed exorcisms that he simply would call the demon by name and cast it out. But today, very often, first of all, there has to be a discernment, and I think this was implied in a few moments ago in the prior question. There has to be a discernment as to whether or not what the person is suffering from is of a mental health nature or a medical nature or a preternatural nature. In other words, a nature involving demons and angels. So, you have to rule out the natural before you can go to the supernatural or the preternatural. So, I mean, certainly that would be one major difference. I think another major difference would be, again, when you say antiquity, if it's Jesus, he cast out very often, and that was the end of it. And certainly when the apostles at times cast out, there are places in scriptures where they weren't able to, because either they needed to fast, or they hadn't prayed hard enough, or their faith wasn't strong enough. I mean, those are comments he actually made. This demon can only be driven out by prayer and fasting. So that's the best I can say. The most accurate and most objective thing I can say. Certainly, the involvement of the sciences as part of the discernment. I wouldn't say that there were no prayer teams in the early church. Certainly, even in the letter of James, where there's some clear definition of the institution of the sacrament of the sick. In the letter of James, it's very clear historically that when people were sick, the priest and the people went and anointed them with oil and laid hands on them. So I would assume that dealing with something such as a demon, that there would probably be more than one person, including more than just a priest, dealing with those kinds of situations as well. But certainly the involvement of the sciences, I think, would certainly be a clear demarcation.
Father, after you perform an exorcism, do you follow up with, I guess you'd call him a victim? I really don't know how to ask that.
Well, I understand your question. After you perform an exorcism, what happens then? And what happens then is you follow it up with another exorcism, and you would very often. First of all, the question you didn't ask, but it does get begged in here. How do you know when the demon has been cast? How you know when the demon has been cast is when the manifestations end, and there is a substantial reason to believe that the demon is gone. So very often, again, now we're talking about formal exorcisms or even deliverance prayer. When the manifestations end, that doesn't absolutely unequivocally mean that the demon has left. It could be the demon is hiding. And so you continue to pray the rite of exorcism until you yourself are satisfied, based largely on observation and judgment, that the demon has left. And then you would follow it up with another, maybe within a month another exorcism to make sure, I call it the cleanup, but to make sure that any residue, any part of that demonic presence is completely gone.
Now, when you say demonic, you mean pure evil, right?
I'm talking about personified evil.
Yeah.
It's pure evil to me would be an intelligent being, as opposed to a force. I mean, I'm talking about an intelligent being that's attached. In the same way that we think of angels as intelligent beings, demons are intelligent beings because they're deposed angels.
Right. Father Thomas, when you speak of these manifestations, what are you talking about there? Are you talking about like tricks that the demons use to scare or intimidate their host?
I wouldn't per se call them tricks, although some of the manifestations I think you could say they're certainly methods of intimidation. So, for example, very, very often, if a person has a demonic attachment, whether it be a full possession or whether it be a partial possession, very often the person's eyes will roll in the back of their head, and you'll only be able to see the whites of their eyes. The reason for that is because the sight of the sacred would be enough to threaten the demon to do that.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Or foaming at the mouth. Now, foaming at the mouth does not mean shaving cream along the corners of the mouth. When we're talking about that, we're talking about excessive amounts of saliva that come as a result of a very unnatural kind of incessant coughing. And that's oftentimes what will happen while the expulsion or the deliverance is going on, that there'll be a kind of coughing. And what it really is, it's the power of the prayers that are stimulating the force of that are stimulating a kind of spiritual force that is forcing the demon out. And the demons enter through the senses, the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the nose. So it's very common during deliverance prayer or the formal rite for a kind of dry heaving or coughing to take place. That very often will lead to excessive amounts of saliva coming forth from the person's mouth, or the person having an inordinate amount of strength. Now, where the quote-unquote, to use your word, tricks come in is very oftentimes the face will be distorted, or the demon will speak in a very guttural voice through the mouth, through the voice box of the person, and will say all kinds of gross things about God, about the Blessed Mother, or about me. Sometimes the person will begin speaking in a language they have no competency in. Sometimes the person's limbs will begin to kind of take on a spasmodic appearance, as if they have some kind of a seizure of some sort. So those would be all what I mean by manifestations. Now, sometimes they're done out of means of intimidation. Sometimes they're done because the demon is threatened, and that's how the demon responds.
It's just a reaction.
It is a reaction. It's a reaction to the power of the prayer, and also a reaction to the authority uttered by the priest exorcist. But it's really both together.
Now, do you see things that like people see on television? Do you see actual like levitation?
Well,
Have you never seen anything like that?
I've never per se seen a levitation, but all of the manifestations I just described to you moments ago, I have seen those, and I have had people who have invited me to come over to their home to exorcise their home, have told me about objects levitating in their home, but I personally have never seen that myself. Or when I was in Rome, I never really saw a levitation per se.
How long does it take for an exorcism to be performed on a person?
Well, if you go through the ritual as it's printed, you probably can do an exorcism. You can perform an exorcism, again, as the words are printed, in about 40 minutes. However, I don't think I've ever done an exorcism in 40 minutes, because you're observing as you're praying. You're taking, in a sense, you're taking stock of what prayers are having an effect on the person, or if they are, the prayers that directly address the demon can be repeated, which I do regularly. And also you can intersperse, according to the ritual, you can intersperse other prayers. So, for example, the Hail Mary. So, because you may pray through the ritual once, doesn't mean the demon has left. So I would say on average, the vast majority of times when I have performed an exorcism, we're talking 2 to 2.5 hours. The longest I've ever worked with a person was 5 hours. But not the entire ritual, but the prayers that directly address the demon can be repeated. And you're there to try and expel the demon, and the demon wants to do everything it can to A, hide, B, dissuade you from continuing, C, discourage you and discourage the person. And so it's going to do all it can to hold on to the stronghold of that person.
Father, now you talked about your support team that's with you during this process. How do you personally prepare for this ordeal? Because it's an ordeal to go through this.
It is, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what we do. First of all, the formal exorcisms happen only in our parish church, and most of the deliverances as well. Now, deliverance, I differentiate that out where we're using prayers that are not recognized as part of an official ritual. But deliverance prayer can be anything from being spontaneous, invoking God and asking the Lord to expunge the condition of evil and breaking any curses and things of that sort. So that's not the formal rite. In the formal rite, what usually happens is, in terms of preparation, the church is locked. The doors of the church are anointed with chrism. Now, this is not in the ritual. The doors of the church are anointed with chrism to seal the church so that demons cannot just simply leave. Because when they jump, you always want to direct them somewhere, and we direct them to the cross to be bound there. We put out the Blessed Sacrament in a monstrance, which is a sacred vessel in which the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist, the body of Christ, is exposed. We put out an array of relics of saints. We have about 40 relics. So those are all placed on the altar with lit candles and the exposed Blessed Sacrament. The whole team and the person who's going to be exorcised, we would sit in a circle, usually, and there are prayers of protection that are prayed prior to the beginning of the exorcism, protection for the person, protection for the team, and prayers that clearly set the boundaries for what the demons can and cannot do. So all of that is done as a preparation, as a preface for the actual beginning of the exorcism.
Father Thomas, you speak of like visual occurrences happening on the possessed person, like language and the look. Have you ever witnessed a sign of God other than actually casting out the spirit of the possessed, like a feeling of a divine presence or anything of that nature?
I haven't. We call upon the Blessed Mother to sometimes come and help us. We call upon Michael the Archangel to come and help us. Sometimes there's evidence of their presence because sometimes when the demons don't comply, you ask the Blessed Mother to come and to assist. You ask the angels to come and assist. Sometimes there are actual visual effects of that when you ask the angels to force the demon to spread the legs of the victim apart and the arms stretched out, and it happens like in an absolute instant. So clearly there is the presence of Mary and the angels. I've never per se had an experience where I saw Christ. I can certainly tell you an experience that happened to me just a few months ago, that I think clearly was a Christological experience. It was during an exorcism, and it was a very, very warm summer day, and the party over whom we had been praying, we just had hit a brick wall that day, and there was no wind outside. It was an 80-degree day, and about 2 hours into this exorcism, there all of a sudden was an incredible wind that we could hear in the distance, and then came blowing over the roof of our church. And we are all sitting in the back of the church, but in an area where there are no pews, and there's a rug and everything. And I could see through the window where the sacristy was a very large tree, which I've seen many, many times, except this time the tree was moving in one direction because of the force of the wind, but there had been no wind outside. But there was a wind, like a storm wind, blowing over the church, and it blew for, I would say, maybe a minute and a half. And the wind got so strong that the church roof started flapping, and the roof is a flat roof, and so it's not. There are no shingles or composition or anything of that sort, but we could clearly hear a tremendous flapping on the roof, and there was the person over whom we were exorcising. There was 2 family members. There was 3 members of the team, and myself, including two priests. And this went on for about a minute and a half, and then after that happened, there was a tremendous odor that one person described. I did not smell it. Only 2 of the people smelled this odor that smelled like apparent feces. And then the victim, the person over whom we were praying, simply said, "I feel like something went rushing right through me," and it was very good. And that person was totally free. There was never another indication since then, and this was June. There's been no evidence at all of any further demonic attachment.
Father Thomas, we got like 5 minutes left. I want to ask you this question. Is it truth or myth that an exorcist looks to find the name of the actual demon possessing the individual?
Yes. The reason for that, now, that's true in the Catholic tradition. In the Christian tradition, outside of Catholicism, I cannot speak for the Orthodox. They have their own right. But other Christian traditions that use more like what we call deliverance, at least Protestants who I've spoken to have said that the name is not important for them to know. In our tradition, it is. It's in the ritual. The reason for that is because in the same way that at the beginning of the celebration of the sacrament of baptism, the first question that is asked by the deacon, priest, or bishop of the parents, if the child is not old enough to speak for themselves, or of a child or an adult who can speak for themselves, what is your name? The reason for that is the naming of the person has a biblical connection, and that connection is, in the Old Testament, God named the patriarchs and prophets. He called them by name. In the New Testament, Jesus calls the apostles by name to fulfill their mission. And so when they are called by name, they are called into the realm of the light. In the same way, in a completely reversed but yet same way, by calling the demons into the realm of the light, you're calling them out of their realm of darkness. And by calling them into the realm of the light, you're exposing them. And having them call their name means they are exposed. And once their name is known, they begin to lose their power.
I'm sorry to say this, Father, but we're almost out of time. Do you have any advice for anybody out there? We still got like 3 more minutes.
All right. My advice would be this. If you ever believe that you are under spiritual attack in a way that you think has something to do with the diabolical, the demonic, go and consult a minister or a priest. And you want to stay. There's four ordinary means of protection to avoid demonic attack: a moral life, a prayer life, a faith life. For a Catholic, a sacramental life. For a Christian, depending upon denomination, some denominations have 1 or 2 sacraments. In our tradition, we have 7. But certainly, a prayer life, faith life, moral life are the means of the spiritual armor we all need to have. And as I said, for a Catholic, certainly the life involving the sacraments. And don't be afraid.
That's a big one right there, Father Thomas, because that what you have talked about, it is scary.
It is scary, and Satan wants us to be afraid, and God gives us the grace not to be. And Jesus very often in the Gospels is saying over and over again, do not be afraid. And I know it can be frightening for people, but you really got to pray for the grace not to be, and realize that the war is over. The battles go on, but the war is over. Christ has already defeated Satan by his dying on the cross, and the sacrifice of himself on the cross defeated Satan, sin, and death permanently. God gives Satan boundaries for God's greater glory until the second coming, when he will be destroyed forever.
Randy, final words for Father Thomas.
Bless you, Father. Thank you for coming on our show. It was an honor to talk to you, and I wish you the best in all that you do.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for honoring me by asking me to come on and provide some information that hopefully will help your listeners. And if you ever wish to invite me on again, you know where to reach me, and I'd be very happy to come on again sometime.